I retired after 40 years of grinding in corporate logistics, bought a quiet lake house in Michigan, and finally found peace. Then my son-in-law stomped through my front door luggage in hand and announced that his parents were moving into my master suite and I could take the basement. I did not argue. I simply packed my things and smiled. Later that night, I overheard his mother declaring they needed to make this arrangement permanent. They never imagined what I had planned for them. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart entitled family members who mistook your silence for weakness. The smell of sawdust and the gentle lapping of the lake against the dock used to be the only things I heard. I am Bruce, 65 years old. After my wife Diane passed away, the heavy silence of our old city house became unbearable. Every room echoed with her absence. So I took my pension, bought this lakefront sanctuary, and poured my grief into woodworking. I was out on the porch running sandpaper over a mahogany deck chair I had been building for weeks when the crunch of tires on gravel shattered my quiet afternoon. A pristine black SUV tore up the driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust before slamming to a halt near the porch steps. The doors swung open. Out stepped Todd, my son-in-law. He was dressed in a crisp polo shirt looking like he owned the entire county. Behind him emerged his parents, Gary and Patricia, dragging matching designer luggage out of the trunk, with expressions of mild distaste as if my gravel driveway was an insult to their shoes. My daughter Megan stepped out last. She would not even look at me. Her shoulders were slumped, and she kept her eyes glued to the ground, nervously wringing her hands. I set my sandpaper down, wiping my dusty hands on my jeans. Before I could even walk down the steps to offer a greeting, Todd marched right up to me. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask if they could come inside and sit down. He simply dictated his terms. Dad, the housing market is terrible right now. My parents sold their place and they need to stay here for a while. Todd gestured toward my front door, as if he were giving a tour of his own property to prospective buyers. They are taking the master suite upstairs. You can use the basement. The sheer audacity of his demand hung heavily in the warm summer air. This was the home Diane and I had dreamed of for decades, the home I bought with 40 years of sweat and careful saving. And this boy, who had never built a single thing in his life, was evicting me from my own bedroom without a second thought. Gary and Patricia did not even have the decency to look apologetic. Patricia was already peering through my living room windows with a highly critical eye, while Gary checked his phone, completely ignoring my presence. My first instinct was to grab Todd by the collar and throw him off my porch. The anger flared hot in my chest, a sudden inferno demanding to be let out. I wanted to scream, to kick their luxury luggage into the lake, to demand they get off my property immediately. But then I looked at Megan. My daughter looked entirely defeated, manipulated into absolute silence by the man she had married. If I exploded now, Todd would play the victim. He would turn Megan against me, claiming I was an unreasonable, hostile old man who abandoned family in their time of need. Then I remembered Diane. She was always the strategist in our marriage. She used to say, "Bruce, never show your hand when you are holding the trump card. Let them think they are winning until the game is already over." So I swallowed the fire. I spent 35 years in corporate logistics, auditing hostile takeovers and managing supply chain disasters. I knew exactly how to dismantle a threat from the inside. I looked at Todd, who was standing with his chest puffed out, practically begging for a screaming match, so he could justify his aggressive behavior. I did not yell. I did not argue. I gave a slow, deliberate nod. I picked up my tool belt from the railing, strapped it around my waist, and walked past them into the house. I quietly went upstairs to the master suite. I packed my clothes, my framed photos of Diane, and my personal toiletries into a duffel bag and carried them down the narrow wooden stairs to the unfinished basement. As I carried my life down into the dark, I could hear Todd snickering in the hallway above. I heard him tell his father, "I told you the old man would not put up a fight. He is too soft." He practically rolled over. Todd mistook my silence for submission. He truly believed I was broken, just a lonely widower giving way to his demands because I was too weak to stand my ground. He was entirely wrong. That evening, the invasion escalated. I was sitting on a folding chair in the basement, trying to organize my toolboxes in the dim light, when the door at the top of the stairs creaked open. Patricia marched down the wooden steps, her designer heels clicking sharply against the concrete floor. She looked around the basement, her nose wrinkled in absolute disgust as she surveyed my woodworking equipment. "Bruce," she said, her voice dripping with extreme entitlement, "you need to clear out all these saws and workbenches by tomorrow morning. Gary needs this space for his home gym. You simply have too much junk down here." She was demanding I dismantle my woodworking shop, my only sanctuary, and my only coping mechanism for my grief, so her husband could put up a treadmill and some weights. She called my life's work junk. The disrespect was so profound, it was almost comical. Again, the urge to throw her out surged through me, but the trap was not fully set yet. I looked at Patricia, burying my anger deep down, and offered a polite, hollow smile. "Of course, Patricia. I will get my things cleared out tonight." She looked almost disappointed that I did not put up a fight. She huffed, turned around, and marched back upstairs to enjoy the master bedroom I had paid for. But what Patricia did not know was that I was not just going to move my tools. Behind the stack of heavy mahogany lumber in the dark corner of the basement, I had a box delivered earlier that week. I had ordered it intending to keep an eye on the property when I went fishing, but its purpose had just drastically changed. As I pretended to pack away my circular saws and sanders, I quietly opened the box. Inside was a state-of-the-art, ultra-high-definition property security system. It was not just a set of cheap cameras. It was equipped with crystal-clear audio recording and night vision linked directly to an encrypted cloud server on my personal tablet. Under the cover of darkness, while Gary and Patricia slept in my bed, and Todd bragged to Megan about his incredibly smooth takeover of my home, I moved through the house like a ghost. I know every creaking floorboard and every blind spot in this house. I discreetly mounted the tiny virtually invisible lenses in the corners of the living room, tucked them behind the thick crown molding in the kitchen, and concealed them perfectly along the main hallways. I secured the final camera right above the basement stairs, pointing directly at the door. I retreated to the small cot I had set up in the basement, opened my tablet, and watched the high-definition feeds light up one by one in the dark. I put on my headphones and tested the microphones. The audio was flawless. I could hear the refrigerator humming upstairs. I could hear every whisper, every footstep, every arrogant laugh they would share. Todd and his parents thought they had conquered my home. They thought I was a pushover they could walk all over without a single consequence. But they had just willingly moved their entire lives inside an interrogation room, and I was going to hear every single word they said. The basement of the lake house was frigid, smelling strongly of damp earth, exposed concrete, and unfinished pine. I sat on a rigid canvas folding chair, the only piece of furniture I had bothered to bring downstairs, besides a narrow, uncomfortable cot. Above my head, the heavy wooden floorboards groaned under the weight of arrogant footsteps. Gary and Patricia were settling into the master suite, leisurely unpacking their matching designer luggage in the very room I had painted with my own hands just last month. I pulled my thick winter jacket tighter around my shoulders. The physical chill of the concrete floor seeping through the soles of my boots was absolutely nothing compared to the cold realization settling deep within my chest. I opened my tablet. The screen illuminated the dark corner of the basement, casting a pale blue light across the meticulously stacked boxes of my woodworking tools. I plugged in my headphones, ensuring not a single sound would echo in the empty, hollow room. I tapped the glass screen and opened the newly installed security application. 4 high-definition camera feeds appeared simultaneously, dividing my tablet into a grid of perfect surveillance. The living room, the kitchen, the main hallway, and the top of the staircase. The picture quality was immaculate. I could see the tiny dust motes floating in the warm golden glow of the living room lamps. I could see the crisp, polished edges of the granite countertops in the kitchen. For a long, quiet moment, I just watched the empty rooms. This was the sanctuary I had built to heal my broken heart, now occupied by hostile invaders. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the initial burning anger subside into something far more useful. Total, absolute focus. For 35 years, I did not just push paper at a desk or sit in meaningless meetings. I was a senior director of corporate logistics and supply chain auditing. My entire career was built on walking into failing, bleeding companies, identifying the parasitic executives, draining the resources, and dismantling hostile takeovers piece by bloody piece. When a massive rival corporation tried to gut a vulnerable business, Tia was the man the board of directors called to audit the damage. I knew exactly how to track hidden assets through labyrinths of fake paperwork. I knew how to sit in a leather chair in a boardroom, perfectly silent, while corrupt vice presidents lied right to my face. I knew how to find the exact hidden pressure point that would cause a fraudulent empire to collapse overnight. Todd thought he was dealing with a tired, broken old carpenter. He thought I was just a grieving widower who would simply roll over, surrender my territory, and hand him the keys to the castle without a single word of protest. He did not realize he had just initiated a hostile takeover against a man who spent 4 decades destroying arrogant corporate raiders for a living. I knew that the first rule of surviving an ambush was to gather actionable data. You never strike when you are blind. You wait in the shadows, you watch their movements, and you let them expose their own weaknesses. I shifted my mindset entirely. I was no longer Bruce, the displaced and disrespected father. I was the auditor, and my own beautiful home was now an active crime scene. I enlarged the living room feed on my tablet, bringing the image to full screen. Gary walked into the frame. He was wearing an expensive dark blue silk robe that he must have packed in his luxury luggage. He strolled across my living room rug with the casual, sickening entitlement of a conquering king surveying his new kingdom. He paused in front of the custom oak cabinet I had built specifically to house my small collection of fine liquor. I watched my jaw tightening so hard, my teeth ached, as he opened the glass doors without a single second of hesitation or guilt. He reached past the everyday bottles of wine and standard whiskey, his hand reaching into the very back of the cabinet. He pulled out a heavy, intricately carved crystal decanter. It was a 20-year-old single-barrel bourbon. Diane had bought it for me on the exact day I officially retired from the logistics firm. We had promised to drink it together on our anniversary, but she passed away before we ever got the chance. I had not been able to bring myself to open it since the day of her funeral. It was sacred to me. It was a beautiful memory stored in amber glass. Gary held the decanter up to the reading light, admiring the rich golden color, and smiled a greedy, selfish smile. He walked over to my bar cart, grabbed 2 of my heavy crystal tumblers, and poured generous, sloppy measures of the precious liquid into each glass. He did not ask for permission. He did not care about the sentimental value. He was carelessly drinking my memories as if they were complimentary beverages at a cheap resort. Patricia walked into the camera frame a moment later. She was wearing a plush velvet nightgown, her hair wrapped tightly in a white silk towel. She took the glass Gary handed her, took a large sip, and let out a loud, highly satisfied sigh. She sank deeply into my favorite leather recliner, kicking her bare feet up onto the mahogany coffee table I had spent 3 grueling months carving and sanding by hand. Gary sat on the sofa opposite her, swirling the expensive bourbon in his glass, looking incredibly pleased with himself. I turned up the volume on my headphones, pressing the foam tightly against my ears. The audio transmission was incredibly sharp. I could hear the faint clinking of the ice against the heavy crystal. I could hear the deep, relaxed breaths they took in the warmth of my home. "This place is actually quite spectacular," Gary said, his voice echoing clearly and loudly through my headphones. The old man really outdid himself with the renovations. The property value out here on the lake must be absolutely skyrocketing right now. Patricia took another long, greedy sip of Diane's anniversary gift. "It is a total gold mine," she agreed, her tone sharp, flat, and highly calculating. "But we cannot just treat this as a fun little summer vacation, Gary. We need to focus on the long game. Todd has done exceptionally well getting us in the front door today, but we need to secure our permanent position before the old man figures things out. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my eyes narrowing. The damp air in the basement felt suddenly thinner, harder to breathe. This was exactly the raw data I was waiting for. This was the unvarnished, ugly truth spoken only when thieves truly believe no one is listening to them. "What do you mean?" Patricia, Gary asked, lounging comfortably back against the sofa cushions. "We are already sleeping in the master bedroom. The old guy is literally sleeping on a concrete floor in the basement. Todd has him completely intimidated and totally under control." Patricia shook her head, leaning forward in my recliner. Her eyes were hard, entirely devoid of the fake, polite warmth she had displayed when she first arrived in my gravel driveway. "Being inside the house is not nearly enough," she said coldly. "We need to make this permanent. Once Todd gets Megan to sign the joint asset agreement, we can force the old man into assisted living and sell this place." A freezing chill washed over my entire body, starting from my neck and traveling all the way down to my boots. A joint asset agreement. Megan had always kept her finances strictly separate from Todd. She had her own savings account, her own successful career, and her fiercely protected independence. If Todd forced her or manipulated her to merge everything they owned, he would gain absolute legal control over her financial decisions. He would have direct access to the trust funds I had carefully set up for her future. He would have his greedy hands on every single dollar my daughter had ever earned. Gary smiled, taking another heavy swallow of the stolen bourbon. "And once they share the assets, what then? What is the ultimate goal here?" Patricia set her crystal glass down on my coffee table with a heavy, careless thud. "Then we take the final step," she said, her voice dropping into a chilling, businesslike whisper. "Bruce is clearly declining mentally. You saw him today out on the porch. He did not even put up a single fight when we took his bedroom away. He is weak. He is lost in his grief. He is practically a shell of a man at this point. Once Todd controls Megan's assets, we can easily claim the old man is a danger to himself. We can force him into an assisted living facility." She paused, letting the deeply malicious weight of her words settle in the quiet living room. "And once he is locked away in a nursing home, Todd and Megan will have automatic power of attorney over his estate. We sell this beautiful lake house. We take the massive equity. We buy that luxury condo in Florida we always wanted, and Todd can finally wipe out those massive gambling debts he has been hiding from Megan. It is a completely perfect solution for all of us." I sat completely frozen in the dark basement. The glowing screen of my tablet illuminated my face, but I could not feel my own skin. The sheer overwhelming magnitude of their betrayal was staggering. This was not just a temporary, inconvenient family visit. This was not a family imposing on a relative during a tough housing market. This was a highly orchestrated, malicious conspiracy. They intended to steal my home, strip my only daughter of her financial independence, and lock me away in a medical prison until the day I died. They wanted to throw me into a miserable home and drug me into compliance. They wanted to sell the beautiful sanctuary I built to honor Diane's memory. They wanted to drain my daughter dry just to cover Todd's secret, reckless debts. My hands slowly balled into tight fists, my knuckles turning bone white in the darkness of the basement. The initial hot anger I had felt on the porch was entirely gone now. It had been replaced by something much colder, much heavier, and infinitely more dangerous. I was no longer a father dealing with an arrogant, disrespectful son-in-law. I was the corporate auditor, and I had just uncovered the ultimate fraud happening right under my own roof. I reached out with a perfectly steady finger and tapped the record button on the security application. A small, bright red circle appeared in the corner of the screen, capturing every single treacherous word of their toxic confession. I saved the high-definition video file directly to a secure, encrypted folder on the tablet. I backed it up to a remote cloud server. Then I backed it up again to a physical drive I kept in my tool belt. I took off my headphones and let them rest around my neck. The basement was dead silent again, but the silence no longer felt like an exile or a punishment. It felt exactly like a war room. Patricia and Gary thought they had won the entire game on the very first day of their arrival. They thought my quiet surrender on the porch was the pathetic silence of a defeated, broken man. They had absolutely no idea that my silence was simply the quiet before a devastating, inescapable storm. I looked at the cold concrete walls around me and smiled a bitter, deeply hardened smile. I was going to let them enjoy the master suite for a little while longer. I was going to let them drink my sacred bourbon and make their grand evil plans. Because when the time finally came to present my audited findings, I would not just serve them with an eviction notice. I was going to legally, financially, and permanently destroy their entire world. The sun had not even crested the tree line when I slipped out the back door of the basement. The damp morning mist hung thick and heavy over the dark water of the lake. 40 years of waking up at 5 in the morning to audit massive supply chains trains your physical body better than any alarm clock ever could. I knew Gary and Patricia would not be awake for hours. I knew Todd usually dragged himself out of whatever comfortable bed he was sleeping in around 9. I needed to control the flow of information coming into my house, and that meant I had to completely control the metal mailbox sitting at the very end of my half-mile gravel driveway. I pulled the collar of my heavy jacket up against the biting morning chill. The crunch of my boots on the gravel sounded impossibly loud in the absolute quiet of the dawn. My breath plumed in the cold air as I walked the long distance to the main road. In the corporate world, you learn very quickly that whoever controls the paper trail controls the entire narrative. Todd was trying to control the narrative of this sudden family invasion. He was playing the role of the generous son managing his parents during a tough real estate market. I knew from the audio recordings I captured the night before that his story was a complete fabrication, but an auditor never acts on audio alone. You need documented, undeniable proof. You need the paper. I reached the end of the driveway and pulled open the heavy metal door of the mailbox. The hinges let out a sharp squeak. Inside sat a thick stack of letters wrapped in a rubber band. I pulled the bundle out and walked over to the cab of my old pickup truck, parked near the storage shed. I climbed inside, shut the door to block out the freezing wind, and turned on the overhead dome light. I slipped the rubber band off the stack and began to sort through the paper trail with clinical precision. Most of it was my usual junk mail, local hardware store catalogs, and monthly utility bills. But tucked neatly between a fishing magazine and a grocery store flyer were 3 thick, official-looking envelopes. They had been forwarded from an address in Chicago. They were addressed directly to Gary and Patricia. You do not need to open a sealed envelope to know when a financial entity is bleeding to death. The stark, bold red lettering stamped across the outside of the white paper told the entire devastating story. Final notice. Urgent legal action required. Asset seizure proceedings initiated. I held the envelopes up closer to the pale yellow light of the truck cab. The stiff, formal paper confirmed my absolute darkest suspicions. Todd had stood on my front porch just yesterday and arrogantly declared that his parents had sold their house because the housing market was terrible. That was a complete, calculated, and absolute lie. They had not sold anything. The bank had seized their property. They had been evicted. They had been foreclosed on. Gary and Patricia were entirely bankrupt. My mind raced in the quiet cab of the truck, assembling the jagged pieces of the puzzle with the ruthless efficiency of a seasoned investigator. If Gary and Patricia were broke, they had literally nowhere else to go. They were destitute. But why would Todd move them into my private lake house instead of putting them up in a cheap apartment in the city? The answer hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Todd was broke too. I remembered the chilling audio recording from the night before, where Patricia mentioned Todd needing to wipe out his massive gambling debts. This was not a family seeking temporary shelter during a transitional period. This was a highly coordinated invasion by 3 drowning people who were absolutely desperate to steal my life raft. They needed my house. They needed my equity. They needed my daughter to sign over her assets so they could drain her bank accounts to save themselves from total ruin. I quietly slipped the 3 collection notices into the deep inner pocket of my heavy jacket. I wrapped the rubber band back around the remaining mundane mail and walked back to the mailbox, placing the stack exactly as the postal worker had left it. I wanted Todd to find the mail. I wanted to watch his reaction when he realized the most dangerous pieces of paper were missing. I walked back to the house and descended into the dark basement. A few hours later, the heavy, arrogant footsteps began to echo on the hardwood floors upstairs. I opened my tablet and pulled up the live security feeds. I watched Todd walk out the front door, wearing his expensive leather slippers, and jog down the long gravel driveway. I switched to the porch camera and watched as he returned a few minutes later with the stack of mail in his hands. His face immediately dropped. He stopped dead in the middle of the porch. He frantically sifted through the grocery flyers and the utility bills, his hands moving with frantic, undisguised panic. He flipped the stack over, checking between the pages of the magazines. He was desperately looking for those collection notices. He was acting as the frantic gatekeeper of their financial ruin, ensuring that my daughter Megan never saw the terrifying truth about the people sitting at her breakfast table. I locked my tablet, stood up from my cot, and walked upstairs to the kitchen to pour myself a cup of black coffee. I needed to look him in the eye. I needed to measure his panic. Todd was standing by the kitchen island, staring blankly at the empty envelopes spread across the granite counter. He was chewing aggressively on his thumbnail, a nervous habit he only displayed when he was losing control. I walked into the room and offered a polite, cheerful good morning. Todd physically jumped, startled by my sudden appearance. He quickly swept his arms over the counter, gathering the junk mail into a messy pile and shoving it aside. He forced a tight, incredibly fake smile onto his face and asked me if the mail carrier had come early today. I poured my coffee slowly, letting the dark liquid fill the mug, while I let him sweat in the silence. I took a sip, looked him directly in the eyes, and told him I had absolutely no idea. I told him I had been in the basement all morning organizing my tools. The visible relief that washed over his face was pathetic. He let out a long breath, his shoulders dropping. He actually believed he was safe. He believed his terrible secret was secure. He quickly excused himself, claiming he needed to make some urgent business calls, and scurried up the stairs to the master bedroom to update his parents on the missing mail. Watching him run away, my heart broke for my daughter. Megan was sleeping next to a ticking time bomb. She was an independent, successful woman who had always been careful with her money. Now her own husband was actively plotting to manipulate her into a joint asset agreement, just so he could sacrifice her financial future to cover his secret gambling losses and save his bankrupt parents from living on the streets. I could not just tell her. If I went to her now with accusations, Todd would spin it. He would call me a paranoid, bitter old man who was trying to destroy their marriage. He would accelerate their plan to have me committed. I needed undeniable, bulletproof evidence that could stand up in a court of law. I took my coffee back down to the basement and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. I sat down at my makeshift desk and pulled the 3 collection notices from my jacket pocket. I needed to secure the physical evidence without leaving a trace that I had intercepted it. I took a small electric kettle I used for tea and boiled a cup of water. I carefully held the sealed flaps of the envelopes over the rising steam. It was an old technique I had learned decades ago when I needed to audit fraudulent shipping manifests without alerting the corrupt vendors. The hot moisture slowly dissolved the adhesive, allowing me to open the letters without tearing the paper. I pulled the documents out and smoothed them flat on my desk. The sheer volume of the debt was staggering. There were notices of asset seizures, threats of wage garnishments, and final warnings from predatory lending agencies. Gary and Patricia owed hundreds of thousands of dollars. They were not just broke. They were being actively hunted by multiple corporate legal departments. I pulled out my portable digital scanner and meticulously scanned every single page of the collection notices. I uploaded the high-resolution images directly into the encrypted server containing the audio recordings of their late-night confession. I was building an impenetrable fortress of data. Every lie they told, every debt they hid, every malicious plan they spoke out loud was being cataloged and secured, Once the scans were complete, I carefully folded the letters back into their original creases. I used a tiny dab of clear craft glue from my woodworking kit to reseal the envelopes perfectly. They looked entirely untouched. I placed them back into my jacket pocket. I planned to slip them into the stack of mail the following day, letting Todd find them, just to watch his blood pressure spike again. Let him think the Postal Service simply made a delayed delivery. The psychological warfare was just as important as the legal warfare. I had the audio confession outlining their malicious intent. I now had the documented financial records proving their absolute desperation. The foundation of their arrogant lies was severely cracking under the weight of my silent audit. But I knew this was not enough to guarantee their total destruction. I knew my next step was to verify the exact magnitude of Todd's specific gambling debts and to legally block his desperate attempt to trap my daughter in that joint asset agreement. To do that, I could not rely on cameras and intercepted mail alone. I needed legal authority, professional muscle, and absolute secrecy. I needed to leave the lake house for a few hours and make a very important, highly confidential visit to the city. The parasites in my house believed they were tightening the noose around my neck, but they had no idea I was already building the gallows. I walked up the basement stairs carrying a faded canvas grocery bag. The main floor smelled of expensive bacon and dark roast coffee. Patricia stood at my stove cooking breakfast as if she had owned the place for decades. Todd sat at the head of my dining table casually scrolling through his phone. I announced I was driving into town to buy groceries. Todd did not even bother to look up. He waved his hand dismissively and ordered me to pick up a specific brand of imported sparkling water. He spoke to me like a hired servant. I nodded, quietly walked out the front door, and climbed into my truck. I did not drive to the local supermarket. I turned onto the highway and drove straight toward the city skyline. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I have known Warren for 20 years. He is a senior attorney at a ruthless downtown law firm. Back when I managed supply chains, Warren was the bulldog who drafted my most complex corporate contracts. He is a man who speaks very softly but destroys opposing counsel with absolute precision. I walked past his receptionist without an appointment and stepped directly into his office. I dropped the scanned collection notices onto his heavy mahogany desk. Warren did not ask how I was doing. He took one look at the cold anger in my eyes, put on his reading glasses, and examined the documents. I sat across from him and laid out the entire situation. I told him about the sudden invasion, the audio recording from the basement, the malicious plan to force me into a nursing home, and the urgent pressure on my daughter Megan to sign a joint asset agreement. Warren leaned back in his leather chair. His expression turned to solid stone. He asked me for Todd's full legal name and social security number. I had secured a copy of Todd's old tax return from Megan's file box a year ago. It is the habit of a highly cautious father to know exactly who his daughter is marrying. I handed the information over. Warren called his lead investigator into the room and ordered a deep, completely silent financial background check. We needed to know exactly what kind of monster was sleeping in my house. We waited in his office for 2 hours. We drank bitter black coffee in total silence. In the corporate world, you learn that waiting is the most excruciating part of any audit. When the investigator finally returned, he handed Warren a thick, heavy folder. Warren read through the pages, his eyes narrowing sharply. He closed the folder and slid it across the desk toward me. Todd was not just broke. He was hemorrhaging money at a terrifying rate. He had secretly opened multiple credit cards in Megan's name, maxing them out on illegal online gambling platforms. But the credit cards were only the surface of the rot. The most devastating revelation was the private loans. Todd owed over $300,000 to aggressive offshore betting syndicates. These were not the kind of lenders who send polite warning letters in the mail. These were the kind of people who ruin lives and destroy families to collect their debts. The entire puzzle snapped into brutal, terrifying clarity. The conflict was no longer just about Gary and Patricia needing a free place to live. It was about Todd running out of time. He was drowning in toxic debt, and he needed a massive influx of cash immediately. He brought his bankrupt parents into my lake house to create an unbearable psychological pressure cooker. Gary and Patricia were acting as his emotional enforcers. Their constant overbearing presence, their subtle insults, and their absolute invasion of our space were deliberately designed to exhaust Megan mentally and physically. Todd was playing the role of the supportive, loving husband. He was offering to consolidate their finances just to make things easier, promising to handle all the stressful paperwork so Megan could relax. He needed her to sign that joint asset agreement before the offshore lenders decided to come looking for him. The second my daughter signed that document, her protected savings, her pristine retirement funds, and the secure trust I had built for her future would instantly become his legal property. He would drain her accounts completely dry and wire the money overseas to save his own skin, leaving her bankrupt and entirely ruined. Warren looked at me across the desk with grim certainty. He told me that if Megan signed that agreement, the money would vanish across international borders in a matter of seconds. The authorities would never be able to pull it back. We had to stop her from signing. But I knew that if I simply drove back to the lake house and accused Todd right now, Megan would not believe me. Todd had been gaslighting her for months, slowly separating her from her independence. If I yelled and made accusations, Todd would spin the narrative perfectly. He would convince her that I was losing my mind, playing right into Patricia's evil plan to have me declared mentally incompetent and committed to a facility. I needed to trap Todd legally. I needed to let him think he was winning until the trap snapped shut around his neck. I asked Warren what we could do to build a wall around my property and my daughter. Warren smiled a very cold, deeply calculating smile. He pulled a fresh legal pad from his desk drawer. We spent the next 3 hours drafting a masterstroke. We designed a plan that would turn my entire estate into a ghost, an irrevocable legal trap that Todd would walk right into with open arms. I left the law office feeling a new dangerous energy pumping through my veins. I had a customized pen securely tucked into my jacket pocket and a strategy that would obliterate my son-in-law entirely. Now I just had to drive back to the lake house, hand Todd his imported sparkling water, and wait for the parasites to make their fatal mistake. I packed my tackle box and slung my fishing rod over my shoulder. I walked through the kitchen where Patricia was complaining loudly about the water pressure and announced I was heading out to the lake for the entire afternoon. Todd barely looked away from the television. I walked down the dock, untied the small aluminum boat, and rowed out toward the bend. I did not cast a single line. I navigated into a dense grove of weeping willows hidden from the house, dropped the anchor, and opened my tablet. I did not have to wait long. Less than 20 minutes after I left, the security camera in the main hallway picked up movement. Todd was pacing outside the closed door of my home office. I always kept it locked with a simple brass padlock Diane and I had picked out together. Todd looked over his shoulder, ensuring his wife and parents were occupied in the other rooms. He pulled a heavy flathead screwdriver from his pocket. He wedged the metal between the doorframe and the strike plate. With a sharp, ugly crack, the wood splintered and the door swung open. He had just broken into my private sanctuary. I switched the tablet feed to the camera hidden inside the office smoke detector. Todd moved with frantic, desperate energy. He was not looking casually. He pulled out drawers, dumped file folders onto the floor, and tossed my personal letters aside like garbage. He was a drowning man looking for a lifeline. In the corporate world, desperation always leaves a messy paper trail. Finally, he reached the bottom drawer of my heavy oak desk. He pulled out a thick red folder. I knew exactly what was inside. Todd flipped through the thick stack of legal papers until he found the heavy parchment. It was a copy of the deed to the lake house. I watched his face contort into a sickening, triumphant smile. He held the document up to the light, as if he had just discovered buried treasure. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket and immediately dialed a number. I pressed my headphones tightly against my ears, holding my breath in the damp air of the willow grove. The audio feed picked up his voice perfectly. He did not sound arrogant anymore. He sounded breathless, eager, and highly anxious. He spoke rapidly into the receiver, telling the person on the other end that yes, he had the collateral they discussed. He confirmed the property was fully paid off with zero existing mortgages and total clear equity. There was a brief pause as the person on the other end spoke. Todd nodded aggressively, pacing across my ruined office. He promised them that his father-in-law was co-signing the loan. He lied through his teeth, claiming I had agreed to it this very morning. He swore he would have my signature on the application by tomorrow. He outlined the rest of his devastating plan, demanding that the first payout must completely clear his offshore accounts. He instructed them that the remaining balance would go directly toward a down payment on a new luxury condo in the city for his parents. He told the lender to send the final paperwork to his personal email right away. The cold reality of his words settled over me in the quiet boat. Todd was not just planning to steal my daughter's assets through a joint agreement. He was attempting to hijack my entire estate behind my back. He was going to forge my signature on a massive equity loan with a predatory lender. He intended to use my home to wipe clean the hundreds of thousands of dollars he owed to dangerous gambling syndicates. Worse, he was extracting extra cash from the fraudulent loan to buy a luxury condo for Gary and Patricia, effectively rewarding them for their role in this psychological torture. If his forgery succeeded, the predatory lenders would place an immediate lien on my lake house. When Todd inevitably defaulted on the loan payments, because gamblers always default, the bank would foreclose on the property. I would be thrown out onto the street, losing the only home I had left. My daughter would remain legally chained to a man who had orchestrated the total financial destruction of her family. Any normal man might have driven the boat straight back to the dock, marched into the house, and beaten his son-in-law to a bloody pulp. But physical violence is the tactic of a man who has lost control of the board. An auditor never interrupts an adversary who is busy manufacturing their own criminal evidence. Every word Todd spoke to that lender was undeniable wire fraud. Breaking into my office was breaking and entering. Forging my signature would be a severe felony. I had the high-definition video. I had the crisp audio recording. I had the precise timeline of events safely uploaded to a secure cloud server. I closed the tablet and picked up the oars. The water rippled softly against the aluminum hull as I rowed back toward the main channel. I needed to let Todd print out those fraudulent loan documents. I needed to let him sit in my house feeling invincible, believing he had outsmarted a foolish old widower. He was going to present those papers to me eventually, hidden underneath some other mundane family documents, or he was going to simply forge my name in the dead of night. Either way, he was signing his own absolute destruction. I just needed to maintain my completely silent facade for a few more days. I would let the tension build in the house, let Gary and Patricia continue their arrogant parade, and prepare the customized pen Warren had given me for the exact moment the trap needed to spring shut. Todd thought he was burying me in debt, but he was actually handing me the shovel he would use to dig his own grave. The psychological warfare started on a Tuesday morning. In the corporate world, when a hostile entity wants to remove a senior executive, they do not fire him outright. They slowly strip away his credibility. They misplace his reports. They delete his calendar invites. They make him look incompetent in front of the board of directors until he starts to doubt his own sanity. Gary and Patricia were attempting to run the exact same playbook in my own home. They needed to convince my daughter that my mind was failing so they could legally seize control of my estate. I walked into the kitchen to grab a glass of water. I deliberately placed my heavy ring of truck keys directly on the center of the kitchen island. I poured my water and turned my back for exactly 10 seconds to look out the window at the lake. In my peripheral vision, I caught the sudden movement. Patricia glided across the kitchen floor in her velvet slippers. Her hand darted out, snatching my keys from the granite counter. She smoothly dropped them into the deep pocket of her morning robe and walked back to the dining table, picking up her coffee cup as if nothing had happened. I turned back to the kitchen island. I let my shoulders slump. I began to pat my pockets with exaggerated, frantic movements. I muttered to myself, putting a slight fearful tremble into my voice. I asked Patricia if she had seen my keys. She looked over the rim of her coffee cup. She tilted her head, painting a look of deep, pitying concern across her face. She told me I had not brought any keys into the kitchen. She suggested in a sickeningly sweet tone that I was probably just getting confused again. She asked if I was getting enough sleep down in the basement. I played the part perfectly. I rubbed my temples, closed my eyes, and let out a long, heavy sigh. I mumbled an apology, acting like a frail, lost old man who could no longer trust his own memory. I shuffled out of the kitchen with my head bowed down. As soon as I closed the basement door behind me, my posture straightened. I pulled out my tablet and saved the crystal-clear video of her stealing my property. The sabotage escalated the very next day. I watched on my tablet as Gary stood by the front door, sorting through the morning mail. He found an envelope containing my monthly water bill. He looked around the empty living room, crumpled the thick envelope in his fist, and buried it deep at the bottom of the kitchen trash can. That evening, when Megan came home from work, Gary launched his next attack. He stood in the kitchen holding a final notice letter he had supposedly just found in the mailbox. It was an old notice I had already paid online, but Gary waved it around like a smoking gun. He spoke loudly, ensuring his voice carried down the hallway so Megan would hear every single word. He told my daughter that he was deeply concerned about my financial hygiene. He claimed I was throwing away important bills and forgetting to pay the utilities. He put a hand on Megan's shoulder and whispered that it was a classic sign of cognitive decline. He said it was incredibly dangerous for an old man to manage a property this large when his mind was clearly slipping away. Megan looked devastated. Her eyes filled with unshed tears. She looked at me sitting quietly in the corner of the room, playing the role of a confused, silent ghost. She asked me gently if I was having trouble remembering my bills. I looked down at my hands and offered a weak, non-committal shrug. Every fiber of my being wanted to stand up, retrieve the crumpled envelope from the trash, and expose Gary as a liar right to his face. But an auditor does not reveal his evidence until the final presentation. I swallowed my pride and let my daughter believe I was fading away. The guilt of deceiving her was heavy, but it was a necessary armor to protect her future. The final, most dangerous phase of their gaslighting campaign happened on a Friday afternoon. It was the boldest move they had made, and it proved exactly how ruthless they were willing to be to secure their luxury condo. I was in the living room pretending to read a newspaper while secretly monitoring the kitchen camera on my phone. Patricia walked up to the expensive gas stove I had installed for Diane. She looked around to ensure the room was empty. She reached out and turned the heavy metal dial on the front burner. The igniter clicked rapidly, and a ring of blue flame flared to life. Patricia simply turned around and walked upstairs, leaving an open, unattended fire burning in my kitchen. 10 minutes later, the front door unlocked. Megan was home early from the office. The moment my daughter stepped into the entryway, Patricia came rushing down the stairs with dramatic, manufactured panic. Patricia shrieked, clutching her chest. She sprinted into the kitchen and violently twisted the stove dial to the off position. She turned to Megan, her face a mask of absolute terror. She screamed that I had left the burner running for hours. She claimed she came downstairs just in time to prevent the entire lake house from burning to the ground. She grabbed Megan by the hands and sobbed fake tears, crying that I was going to kill them all if I was left unsupervised for another day. Megan stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the warm stove. Her face was completely pale. The sheer terror in her eyes broke my heart. She looked at me standing in the doorway. She did not look at me with anger. She looked at me with profound, agonizing pity. She truly believed her father was losing his mind. She believed the lies because she could not fathom that her husband and his parents were capable of orchestrating such a sinister, theatrical nightmare. Todd walked into the house perfectly on cue. He wrapped his arms around his shaken wife and pulled her into a protective embrace. He kissed the top of her head and whispered that he would handle everything. He told her she did not need to carry this heavy burden alone. He promised he would manage the legal paperwork and secure a safe, permanent medical facility for me before I hurt myself or anyone else. I retreated to the basement without defending myself. I let them build their false narrative brick by poisonous brick. I sat on my uncomfortable cot and watched the saved video files accumulate on my encrypted server. I watched Patricia turn on the stove. I watched Gary throw away my mail. I watched Patricia steal my keys. The evidence was irrefutable. The trap was fully loaded. They had constructed a beautiful, compelling story of a failing old man, and they were utterly blind to the fact that the cameras were capturing the malicious authors at work. I was ready to let them believe they had won the war just so I could completely obliterate them in the final battle. The evening air outside the basement window was heavy with impending rain. I was sitting on my miserable cot, staring at the exposed concrete wall, listening to the muffled sounds of the house above me. Footsteps approached the basement door. They were light and hesitant. They were not the heavy, arrogant stomps of Gary or Patricia, nor the confident, entitled strides of Todd. It was Megan. The door creaked open, and my daughter slowly descended the narrow wooden stairs. She looked incredibly small, clutching a thick, glossy folder to her chest, like a protective shield. Her eyes were red-rimmed and completely exhausted. The psychological pressure cooker Todd had trapped her in was breaking her down piece by piece. She stopped a few feet away from me. She did not look around at my scattered toolboxes or the cold floor her husband had banished me to. She just looked at my face with a profound, agonizing sorrow. She whispered my name, her voice trembling so badly she could barely speak. She told me we needed to talk. I stood up and offered her my folding canvas chair, but she shook her head and wrapped her arms tightly around herself. She told me she could not sleep anymore. She said she was terrified every single time I walked into the kitchen or tried to check the mail. With tears streaming down her cheeks, she repeated every poisonous lie Todd and his parents had planted in her mind over the past few weeks. She brought up the incident with the stove. She cried as she described how Patricia had supposedly saved us all from a devastating fire. She mentioned the collection notices Gary claimed I was throwing in the trash, completely unaware that those notices belonged to her bankrupt in-laws. She told me I was losing my keys, forgetting conversations, and becoming a serious danger to myself. She sobbed openly, burying her face in her hands. She told me that Todd said I was slipping away. She told me Todd said my mind was deteriorating every single day, and she was absolutely terrified. She wept, telling me she did not want to lose me, but she simply did not know how to keep me safe in this big lake house anymore. Hearing my own daughter weep for my sanity was the hardest thing I have ever had to endure in my 65 years of life. My chest tightened so painfully I could barely draw a breath. A father's deepest, most primal instinct is to protect his child from pain, to wrap his arms around her and swear that everything is a lie. I wanted to pull out my tablet right then and there. I wanted to show her the high-definition video of Patricia deliberately turning on that gas stove. I wanted to play the crisp audio of Todd forging loan documents and laughing about my supposed dementia. I wanted to tear her husband's deceitful world apart in front of her very eyes just to stop her tears. But a seasoned corporate auditor knows that revealing the evidence too early gives the guilty party time to build a defense and destroy the paper trail. If I showed her the tablet now, she would be horrified, but she would also be alone in this dark basement with me. She would inevitably have to go upstairs and face Todd. Todd was a man who owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to incredibly dangerous offshore gambling syndicates. A desperate, cornered man is an unpredictable threat. I could not put my daughter in immediate physical danger. I needed to trap Todd in a corner with zero avenues for escape, completely surrounded by legal authority. I needed to swallow my pride and wait for the final presentation. I stepped forward and gently put my hands on her shaking shoulders. I did not defend myself. I did not call her husband a liar. I simply looked into her tear-filled eyes and nodded slowly. Megan reached into the folder she was holding and pulled out a glossy, heavy paper brochure. She handed it to me with trembling fingers. The cover featured a serene, smiling elderly man sitting in a sunlit courtyard. The bold letters across the top read, "Whispering Pines Memory Care." It was a brochure for a secure medical facility. It was a place where they lock the doors from the outside and manage the residents with heavy medication and strict schedules. Todd had actually done it. He had convinced my beautiful, intelligent daughter to voluntarily commit her own perfectly sane father to a medical prison just so he could steal my lake house and cover his gambling debts. I took the brochure from her hands. I looked at the glossy pages, feeling the sheer, unadulterated evil of my son-in-law's master plan. It takes a special kind of monster to use a daughter's genuine love and concern as a weapon against her own family. I folded the pamphlet neatly and slipped it into my shirt pocket. Megan watched me closely, bracing herself for an argument. She was bracing herself for the anger and loud denial that usually accompanies a dementia diagnosis. Instead, I gave her a soft, resigned smile. I told her she did not need to cry anymore. I kept my voice incredibly calm and steady. I told her I understood what was happening to me. I said I knew things had been difficult lately, and I absolutely did not want to be a burden to her or to Todd. Megan let out a massive, shuddering breath. The relief that washed over her exhausted face was heartbreaking to witness. She threw her arms around my neck and hugged me tightly, thanking me over and over for being so understanding and cooperative. She told me Todd had promised to handle all the complex legal paperwork, so I would not have to worry about a single thing. "I am sure he did," I whispered into her hair, patting her back gently. I pulled back and looked her directly in the eyes. I told her I had one final request before we made any permanent decisions about the facility or the property. I asked her to organize a formal family dinner for the following Friday evening. I wanted her, Todd, Gary, and Patricia to sit down with me at the main dining table upstairs. I told her we would share a nice meal, discuss the future, finalize the details of my transition to the care facility, and formally hand over the responsibilities of the estate to her and her husband. Megan agreed immediately. She wiped her eyes, gave me one last loving squeeze, and hurried up the wooden stairs to tell her husband the good news. I stood alone in the dark basement, listening to her footsteps fade away. A few moments later, I heard the muffled, excited voices echoing from the living room above as Todd realized his malicious campaign had worked flawlessly. He truly believed I had surrendered. He believed the lake house, the equity loan, and my daughter's protected assets were finally his for the taking. He was going to spend the next few days celebrating his grand victory completely and entirely unaware of the truth. He had no idea that the Friday dinner he was so eagerly anticipating was not going to be a peaceful handover of my estate. It was going to be the absolute, unavoidable execution of his entire life. The rain finally broke late Thursday afternoon. Thick gray clouds rolled across the lake, casting long, dreary shadows through the expansive glass windows of the living room. It was the perfect atmosphere for a surrender. In the high-stakes world of corporate logistics, the moment you invite a hostile entity to the negotiating table, you must ensure the environment reflects their absolute victory. You want them comfortable. You want them arrogant. Arrogance is the fatal flaw of every thief. I sat in my favorite armchair, the one Diane had bought for my 60th birthday. I did not sit up straight. I deliberately slumped my shoulders forward, letting my chest cave inward to project the image of a frail, defeated old man. I left my hair uncombed. I wore a faded flannel shirt that was slightly wrinkled, and I let my hands rest limply on my knees. I stared out the window at the churning gray water, keeping my eyes wide and vacant. I had to look like a man whose mind was slowly slipping into an inescapable fog. I listened to the sounds of my occupied house. In the kitchen, Patricia was loudly complaining about the weather ruining her afternoon plans. Gary was aggressively flipping through the channels on my television. They were entirely comfortable in their parasitic existence. I took a slow, deep breath, centering myself. It was time to pull the trigger. I called out for Todd. I made sure my voice lacked its usual booming resonance. I let it waver slightly, pitching it lower, lacing it with a manufactured exhaustion. The house went completely quiet for a moment. Then the heavy, confident footsteps echoed down the hallway. Todd walked into the living room, with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, a look of mild annoyance plastered across his face. Gary paused the television, leaning forward with sudden interest. Patricia stopped clattering pots in the kitchen and stood silently in the doorway. Even Megan emerged from the guest room, her eyes darting nervously between her husband and me. They were all gathered, a pack of wolves circling a wounded stag. Todd stopped a few feet away from my chair. He did not ask if I was all right. He simply stared down at me and asked what I wanted. I did not look at him directly. I kept my gaze fixed on the storm outside, acting as though turning my head required too much physical effort. I told him that I had been doing a lot of thinking over the past few days. I let a long, heavy silence stretch across the room, forcing them to hang on my every word. I said that I was starting to realize I was not the man I used to be. I let my voice crack perfectly on the last syllable. The shift in the room's energy was instantaneous. I could practically feel the electricity surging through Todd's veins. Gary sat up completely straight on the sofa, his eyes widening. Patricia took a slow, calculated step into the living room. Megan let out a soft, heartbroken gasp and covered her mouth with her hand. I continued my performance, weaving their own malicious lies into my confession. I told them that I was terrified. I admitted that I could not remember where I put my keys anymore. I referenced the terrifying incident with the kitchen stove, whispering that I could have burned the entire house down with my own family inside. I told them that the collection notices and the bills were becoming a confusing, jumbled mess in my head. I looked down at my trembling hands, a physical manifestation of a broken mind, and confessed that the sheer size of this property was becoming far too much for me to handle alone. Megan rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside my chair. She wrapped her arms around my waist and buried her face in my chest, sobbing openly. She told me it was going to be all right, that they were there for me, that they would never abandon me. Her genuine, agonizing grief was a sharp knife in my gut. I hated causing her this pain, but it was the absolute ultimate camouflage. Her authentic tears sold the reality of my fake surrender better than any acting I could ever muster. Todd did not kneel beside his wife to comfort her. He did not offer me a single word of reassurance. He stood perfectly rigid, staring at me with the hungry, predatory eyes of a starving man who had just been handed the keys to a royal banquet. I gently patted Megan's hair, playing the role of the tragic, fading patriarch. I looked up at Todd, meeting his greedy gaze with dull, defeated eyes. I told him that I was incredibly tired. I said I wanted to spend whatever good years I had left simply resting without the heavy burden of property taxes, maintenance, and legal responsibilities. I took a shaky breath and delivered the ultimate bait. I told him I was officially considering transferring the full management of the estate and all my financial affairs over to him and Megan. The sheer velocity of Todd's reaction was breathtaking. He did not even attempt to mask his desperate excitement. He did not say he needed to think about it. He did not suggest we consult a doctor or a neutral financial planner. A truly supportive family member would have hesitated, overwhelmed by the tragic gravity of a father signing away his life's work. Todd just practically vibrated with adrenaline. He told me that was a very smart, very mature decision. He spoke rapidly, his words stumbling over each other in his haste to secure the victory. He claimed that he and Megan had actually been researching some options, just in case I ever reached this point. He said he wanted to make the transition as smooth and painless as possible for me so I could just relax and enjoy my retirement without a single worry in the world. He turned around and practically sprinted down the hallway toward the guest room they had commandeered. Gary and Patricia exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. Patricia actually smiled, a vicious, victorious smirk that she did not even bother to hide from me. Gary leaned back against the sofa, crossing his arms behind his head, looking like a man who had just won the lottery. They believed their psychological torture had worked flawlessly. They believed they had successfully broken an old man's mind and stolen his fortune. Todd returned less than 2 minutes later. He was carrying a sleek black leather portfolio. He practically threw himself onto the coffee table, sweeping a decorative bowl out of the way to make room. He unzipped the portfolio with trembling fingers and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized stack of legal documents. An auditor knows that preparation is the ultimate sign of premeditation. You do not draft a comprehensive power of attorney and a complex property transfer overnight. These documents had been prepared, reviewed, and finalized days, perhaps weeks in advance. They had been sitting in that leather portfolio just waiting for the exact moment I finally cracked. Todd spread the papers out across the mahogany table. He pulled an expensive silver pen from his pocket and clicked it open. His breathing was heavy, almost ragged. The absolute desperation of his massive offshore gambling debts was pouring out of his pores. He needed my signature to save his life. He pointed to the first document in the stack. He spoke quickly, trying to gloss over the dense legal terminology with smooth, reassuring lies. He told me this was just a standard power of attorney. He claimed it would simply allow him to pay the utility bills and handle the property taxes on my behalf, so I would never have to stress about missing a payment again. I stared blankly at the paper, letting my eyes glaze over, but my mind was reading every single line with razor-sharp precision. It was not a limited power of attorney. It was a durable, absolute power of attorney. It granted him total, unrestricted access to every bank account I owned. It gave him the legal authority to sell my assets, empty my retirement funds, and completely liquidate my entire life. He quickly flipped to the second document, hiding the terrifying clauses of the first. He tapped his silver pen against a fresh signature line. He told me this was just a basic property management transfer. He said it would legally permit him to hire contractors for maintenance and manage the general upkeep of the lake house. Again, I read the fine print hidden beneath his rapid-fire lies. It was a quitclaim deed. If I signed it, I would immediately and irrevocably surrender all ownership rights of the property to him and Megan. I would become a tenant in my own home, subject to immediate eviction the second he decided to throw me out. But it was the third document, buried neatly near the bottom of the stack, that confirmed the terrifying audio recording I had captured in the Willow Grove. Todd did not even bother to explain this one. He simply aligned the edges of the paper and pointed to the bottom line, hoping my supposed mental fog would prevent me from questioning it. It was the application for a massive predatory equity loan against the value of the lake house. The principal amount was staggering, more than enough to wipe out his dangerous gambling syndicates and secure a luxury downtown condo for Gary and Patricia. The lender listed at the top of the page was notorious for ruthless foreclosure practices. By placing this document in the stack, Todd was attempting to legally bind me as the co-signer. When he inevitably took the money and defaulted on the exorbitant monthly payments, the predatory bank would seize my home. He was asking me to sign my own absolute financial execution. Megan looked over his shoulder at the sheer volume of the paperwork. She wiped her eyes and asked Todd if it was really necessary to sign everything right this second. She suggested we should maybe have a lawyer look over it, just to be safe. Todd snapped at her. The mask of the loving husband slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the cornered, terrified gambler beneath. He sharply told her that lawyers take months and cost a fortune. He quickly softened his tone, catching his mistake, and wrapped an arm around her waist. He falsely whispered that he was just trying to protect our family, that delaying this could put my health and safety at serious risk if my mind deteriorated any further. He looked back at me, his eyes wide with manufactured sympathy and profound, greedy anticipation. He slid the documents directly in front of me. He pressed the heavy silver pen into my open palm. His fingers were actually sweating. He looked down at me, offering a warm, perfectly practiced smile that chilled me to the absolute core of my being. "Just sign here, Bruce," he said softly, his voice dripping with poisonous reassurance. "We will take care of you." I sat there holding the silver pen. I looked at the power of attorney. I looked at the quitclaim deed. I looked at the predatory loan application that would destroy my daughter's future. I looked at Gary and Patricia, who were literally holding their breath in the background, waiting for the massive payout they believed they had earned through their malicious gaslighting campaign. I slowly raised my head and looked Todd directly in the eyes. I let the facade of the broken, confused old man fade away for just a fraction of a second. I let him see the cold, calculating auditor staring back at him. But Todd was too blinded by his own desperate greed to recognize the danger. He just tapped the paper again, urging me to finalize his victory. I knew the trap was set up perfectly. The documents were on the table. The intent to commit massive financial fraud was fully documented. I just needed to secure the final piece of the puzzle. I stared at the heavy silver pen Todd was pushing into my palm. I could feel the slick sweat from his fingers, coating the cold metal. It was the pen of a desperate man trying to rush an execution. I did not take it. I let it slip from my hand and clatter against the mahogany coffee table. Todd gasped, with a sharp intake of air, raw panic flashing across his features. He thought I was backing out. He thought his entire fraudulent empire was collapsing at the very last second. But I simply reached into the inner breast pocket of my faded flannel shirt. I told him I preferred to use my own. I told him I had a lucky pen I used for all my important corporate contracts. I pulled out a sleek, matte black fountain pen. It looked perfectly ordinary. It looked like the kind of standard executive gift you receive after 30 years at a logistics firm. But it was not ordinary. It was a precise tactical weapon. When I sat in Warren's downtown law office earlier that week, drafting the masterstroke that would obliterate my son-in-law Warren, had slid this exact pen across his heavy oak desk. He told me it was loaded with a highly specialized chemically volatile ink. It writes as dark and permanent as standard black ink, but the chemical composition reacts strongly with the air. Within 24 hours, the ink completely and totally evaporates. It leaves no residue. It leaves no indentations. It leaves nothing but blank, empty paper. I uncapped the black pen and leaned over the coffee table. My hand shook slightly, but this time it was not an act. It was the absolute thrill of closing the trap. I signed my full legal name on the durable power of attorney. I signed the quitclaim deed surrendering my beautiful lake house to the man who was actively trying to destroy me. I flipped to the very bottom of the stack and signed the predatory equity loan application. With every stroke of the pen, I watched the ink bleed deep into the heavy parchment. As I formed the letters of my name, I almost smiled. Todd thought he was stealing a fortune, but he was actually stealing a total illusion. What he did not know, what he could not possibly know, was that 3 days ago, before I ever drove to Warren's office, I had already executed a massive legal maneuver. A seasoned auditor never leaves an asset unprotected. I had completely transferred the title of the lake house along with every single bank account, investment portfolio, and physical asset I owned directly into an ironclad, irrevocable trust. An irrevocable trust is exactly what it sounds like. It cannot be altered, it cannot be claimed by aggressive creditors, and it absolutely cannot be transferred by a fraudulent quitclaim deed. Once the assets cross that legal boundary, they belong to the trust managed by a neutral third party until my passing. By signing Todd's papers, I was not giving him my home. I was legally transferring the ownership of an asset that no longer existed in my name. Todd was essentially claiming ownership of a ghost. I capped my pen and slid it safely back into my shirt pocket. I pushed the stack of signed documents across the table. Todd lunged for them. He did not even try to hide his desperate greed. He snatched the papers with both hands, his eyes scanning my signatures to ensure I had not missed a single line. His breathing was heavy and almost euphoric. He looked like a man who had just narrowly escaped a burning building. Gary and Patricia let out a simultaneous sickening sigh of relief. Patricia actually clapped her hands together, a short, sharp burst of applause that echoed loudly in the quiet living room. Megan knelt beside my chair, burying her face in my shoulder. She was crying so hard her entire body shook. She whispered that she was so sorry it had come to this, but that it was for the best. She truly believed her father was fading into the dark abyss of dementia, and she believed her husband was stepping up to save our family. I held my daughter tightly, resting my chin against the top of her head. I hated the tears she was shedding, but I knew the pain she felt right now was absolutely nothing compared to the financial ruin Todd had planned for her. I whispered that everything was going to be fine. I told her I just needed to rest. Todd carefully placed the fraudulent documents back into his sleek leather portfolio. He zipped it shut with a loud final sound. He looked down at me, and the mask of the terrified gambler was completely gone. The arrogant, entitled son-in-law had returned in full force. He patted my shoulder with condescending authority. He told me I did the right thing. He promised he would handle the bank first thing in the morning and get the medical facility paperwork sorted out by the weekend. He was already planning my eviction. I slowly stood up from the armchair, leaning heavily on the wooden armrests to maintain the illusion of my frailty. I did not say another word. I turned my back on the living room and shuffled slowly down the hallway toward the basement door. Behind me, the celebration began instantly. I heard Gary tell Patricia to open another bottle of my expensive bourbon. I heard Todd tell Megan he was going to run to the post office to mail the loan application via overnight delivery so the funds would clear as soon as possible. Let him mail it. Let him send those documents to the predatory offshore lenders. By the time that heavy envelope reached the processing center, the dark ink of my signature would have completely vanished into thin air. The bank executives would open a package containing nothing but blank signature lines. But the legal intent to commit massive wire fraud would already be locked in the federal mail system, carrying Todd's return address and Todd's digital footprint. He was mailing the exact evidence the authorities needed to put him away for years. I walked down the wooden stairs into the damp, cold basement. I sat on my rigid canvas cot and pulled out my tablet. I watched the live security feeds as the three parasites rejoiced in their supposed victory above my head. They were toasting their glasses, laughing loudly, and already discussing what kind of luxury countertops they wanted in their new downtown condo. They thought they had successfully broken an old man. They thought they had wiped out hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal gambling debts with a few strokes of a pen. They were completely and utterly oblivious to the fact that they were standing on a trapdoor and I had just pulled the lever. Their illusion of control was total and absolute. I set my tablet down on the concrete floor, closed my eyes, and finally allowed myself to smile. The hardest part was over. I had gathered the intelligence, audited the fraud, and secured the assets. Now all I had to do was wait for Friday night. The heavy oak door at the top of the basement stairs clicked shut. I sat on my rigid canvas cot and opened my tablet. The digital glow illuminated the cold concrete walls around me. I switched the live security feed to the living room. The celebration above my head was already in full swing. The parasites were dancing on what they believed was my grave. Gary and Patricia were sitting together on the leather sofa. They had a laptop open on the coffee table right next to the empty crystal bourbon glasses. They were not whispering anymore. The need for absolute secrecy had evaporated the second I handed over that stack of forged documents. They truly believed they had conquered the fortress. I plugged my headphones in and listened to the raw, unvarnished arrogance of two people who had just stolen an entire lifetime of hard work. Patricia was typing rapidly on the keyboard. Her voice echoed through my headphones, sharp and entirely devoid of any guilt. She told Gary they needed to completely gut the main floor of the lake house by next month. She said my rustic furniture was absolutely hideous and smelled like an old man. She was actively browsing a high-end Italian furniture catalog. I watched her add a $12,000 velvet sectional to an online shopping cart. She did not hesitate. She clicked the mouse with the casual entitlement of a woman spending money she had never earned. Gary leaned over her shoulder, pointing at the screen. He told her to forget the furniture for a minute and pull up the travel websites. He reminded her they had suffered through a miserable year dealing with their foreclosure, and they deserved a massive reward for putting up with my depressing presence. He told her to look up luxury river cruises in Europe. He specifically demanded first-class plane tickets to Vienna. I sat in the dark basement watching them spend a ghost fortune. In the corporate world, I had audited dozens of corrupt executives who embezzled company funds. They all shared the exact same fatal flaw. They could never wait for the money to actually clear before they started spending it. Greed is an incredibly impatient master. Gary and Patricia were mentally spending hundreds of thousands of dollars from a predatory equity loan that was printed on vanishing ink and tied to a totally empty, irrevocable trust. They were booking non-refundable luxury vacations on their already maxed-out credit cards, believing Todd would simply pay off the balances on Monday morning. The living room camera picked up movement from the hallway. Todd strode into the room. He looked entirely, completely reborn. The heavy, suffocating panic of his dangerous offshore gambling debts was completely gone from his face. He walked to the bar cart and poured himself a massive glass of my anniversary bourbon. He raised the crystal glass in the air, offering a victorious toast to his bankrupt parents. He laughed, a loud, booming sound that echoed through the entire house. He told them the old fool handed it over without a single fight. He boasted that I was so terrified of losing my mind that I signed away my entire estate just to make the scary paperwork stop. He took a heavy swallow of the stolen liquor and slammed the glass down on the table. He leaned forward and told Gary and Patricia that the offshore lenders had already approved the preliminary application. He stated with absolute euphoric certainty that the massive equity loan would fully clear by Monday afternoon. Patricia clapped her hands together, looking up at her son with sickening pride. She asked him how long they had to wait before they could force me out of the basement and into the memory care facility. She complained that even knowing I was downstairs, breathing their air, was starting to annoy her. Todd smiled a cold, calculating smile. He told his mother to be patient for just a few more days. He explained that Megan was still feeling incredibly guilty about the situation. He said he needed the weekend to properly groom his wife to convince Megan that shipping her father off to a locked medical ward was an act of profound mercy. He promised his parents that by the middle of next week I would be permanently locked inside a sterile room, staring at a blank wall, and they would have total, undisputed ownership of the entire lake house. Hearing him map out the final stages of my psychological execution did not make me angry. It made me incredibly calm. When an enemy details their entire battle plan out loud, they hand you the exact blueprint for their destruction. Todd was relying entirely on Megan's guilt and my supposed mental decline. He had built his entire fraudulent empire on the assumption that I was broken and my daughter was blind. Megan walked into the living room a few minutes later. The entire atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Gary slammed the laptop shut, hiding the European luxury cruise itineraries. Patricia quickly rearranged her features, replacing her greedy smirk with a mask of weary maternal concern. Todd stepped forward and wrapped his arm around my daughter, kissing her forehead. Megan looked completely drained. The dark circles under her eyes were prominent. She looked at the empty bourbon glasses and asked what they were talking about. Todd smoothly lied right to her face. He told her they were just discussing how to best manage my upcoming medical transition. He said they were praying for my comfort and researching the best doctors to handle my declining cognitive state. Megan leaned into his embrace, seeking comfort from the very monster who was actively trying to destroy her future. She told him she was so tired. She whispered that she felt like a terrible daughter for giving up on me, but she simply did not know how to handle my memory loss anymore. Todd held her tighter, whispering poisonous reassurances into her ear. He promised her she was doing the right thing. He swore he would carry this heavy burden for her. I watched my daughter weep into the chest of a man who intended to drain her bank accounts dry the second my house was foreclosed on. The urge to march upstairs and expose the entire fraud burned in my chest, but I forced myself to remain completely seated on the basement cot. I could not trigger the ambush prematurely. I needed Warren to verify that the fraudulent loan documents had officially hit the bank servers. I needed the ink on those pages to completely evaporate. I needed the legal threshold of felony wire fraud to be crossed beyond any shadow of a reasonable doubt. I reached out and locked my tablet, securing the final video files. The digital vault was full. I had captured the forgery, the psychological manipulation, the stolen mail, the extreme financial desperation, and the absolute undeniable arrogance of their victory celebration. I laid back on the uncomfortable canvas cot and stared up at the exposed wooden floorboards. Upstairs, they were planning luxury vacations and ordering expensive velvet furniture. They were imagining a future built on my complete destruction. I closed my eyes and listened to the faint sound of the rain starting to fall against the basement window. I just needed to survive until Friday evening. I just needed to put on a nice shirt, walk up those stairs, and sit down at my own dining table. They thought Friday dinner was going to be a peaceful transition of power. They had no idea I had invited a firing squad. The heavy oak dining table was set for a celebration. Patricia had spent the entire afternoon polishing my good silver and laying out the expensive linen napkins I had bought for Diane's 50th birthday. Gary sat at the head of the table, a position he had enthusiastically claimed the moment he moved in, adjusting his cuffs with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally won. Todd was standing near the kitchen island, expertly popping the cork on a chilled bottle of imported champagne. The sharp, celebratory crack echoed through the lake house, a sound of pure, unadulterated arrogance. Megan sat quietly next to me. She looked completely exhausted, dark circles bruised beneath her eyes. She reached under the table and gently squeezed my hand, offering a weak, supportive smile. She still believed this dinner was a peaceful surrender. She still believed she was protecting me by allowing her husband to take the reins. I patted her hand, offering a gentle, reassuring nod. I needed her to feel safe because the storm I was about to unleash in this dining room was going to be absolutely devastating. Todd walked over to the table, carrying the bottle of champagne wrapped in a crisp white towel. He filled Gary's glass first, then Patricia's, and finally poured a generous amount for himself. He did not offer any to me or Megan. He raised his crystal flute high in the air, the golden liquid catching the light from the chandelier. To new beginnings, Todd announced, his voice booming with arrogant confidence. To securing the future, protecting the family, and moving forward into a much brighter, much more comfortable chapter. Gary and Patricia enthusiastically raised their glasses, the crystal clinking together in a sickening display of greedy triumph. They drank deeply, celebrating the hundreds of thousands of dollars they believed they had successfully stolen from a broken old man. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the polished mahogany wood. I did not speak. I did not raise a glass. I just watched them. An auditor knows exactly how to read a room, and this room was vibrating with the reckless energy of thieves who think they have gotten away with the ultimate heist. The heavy resonant chime of the front doorbell sliced through the celebratory laughter. The sound was sudden and sharp, instantly killing the mood in the dining room. Patricia frowned, setting her champagne glass down. "Are we expecting someone? Did you order the food already, Todd?" Todd looked confused. He checked his expensive wristwatch, shaking his head. "I did not order anything yet. I thought we were having the caterer drop off the prime rib at 7. He set the champagne bottle down on the table, wiping his hands on his slacks. "It is probably just one of the neighbors coming to complain about the property line again. I will handle it." He walked out of the dining room and down the main hallway toward the entryway. I did not move a single muscle, but my heart began to beat with a steady, powerful rhythm. The trap I had spent a week meticulously building was finally springing shut. I heard the heavy wooden front door swing open. I heard Todd's arrogant, dismissive voice abruptly falter. He did not say a word. There was only a profound, heavy silence drifting down the hallway. A moment later, heavy, authoritative footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor. They were not the steps of a complaining neighbor. Todd slowly backed into the dining room, his face completely drained of color. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. His hands were trembling, and he bumped into the edge of the dining table, nearly knocking over the champagne bottle. Following him into the room was Warren. My attorney was dressed in a sharp, immaculate charcoal suit, carrying a thick leather briefcase. He walked with the calm, devastating presence of a man who executes hostile takeovers for a living. Flanking Warren on his right was a local sheriff's deputy, his hand resting casually near his utility belt. On Warren's left stood a severe-looking man wearing a conservative suit and carrying a sealed manila envelope. I knew exactly who he was. He was the senior fraud investigator for the offshore lending agency Todd had attempted to defraud. Gary stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. What is the meaning of this? Who are you people? Warren did not acknowledge Gary. He did not even look at Patricia, who had frozen with her champagne glass halfway to her mouth. Warren looked directly at Todd, who was visibly shaking sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. Mr. Todd Mitchell, Warren said, his voice smooth, low, and incredibly dangerous. I am Warren Vance, senior legal counsel representing Bruce Henderson. The deputy here is acting as an official witness, and this gentleman represents the lending institution you contacted on Tuesday afternoon. Megan gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked frantically between her terrified husband and the serious men standing in our dining room. Todd, what is going on? What is he talking about? Toddam opened his mouth, but no words came out. The slick, confident manipulator had completely vanished, replaced by a cornered, panicked animal. He looked at me, his eyes wide with absolute horrifying realization. He finally understood that the frail, broken old man sitting quietly at the end of the table had orchestrated this entire ambush. Warren set his heavy leather briefcase down on the mahogany table right next to the stolen anniversary bourbon. He unclasped the brass locks with a sharp, definitive click. The celebration was officially over. The audit had begun. I remained perfectly still in my chair at the end of the mahogany table. Todd was frozen in place, staring at the three men who had just walked into the dining room. Gary tried to stand up and demand an explanation, but the sheriff deputy simply rested his hand on his utility belt and gave Gary a look that immediately forced him back into his seat. The arrogance that had filled the room just moments ago evaporated completely. I slowly stood up from the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or throw accusations. An auditor does not need to shout when the data speaks for itself. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my tablet. I walked over to the massive flat-screen television mounted on the living room wall. I plugged a small cable from my device directly into the screen. The silence in the house was absolute and suffocating. I tapped the screen once. The television flickered to life and high-definition video flooded the room. The audio was incredibly crisp. The footage showed the very room we were standing in, but it was from a few nights ago. Gary and Patricia were sitting on the leather sofa, drinking my expensive anniversary bourbon. Patricia was speaking, and her voice echoed loudly through the dining area. She was explicitly stating that they needed to make their arrangement permanent. She outlined their desperate financial ruin, admitting that their own house had been foreclosed on. Then she detailed their plan to gaslight me. She told Gary they were going to force me into a memory care facility the moment Todd secured the joint asset agreement with Megan. Megan sat at the dining table, with her eyes wide open. Her breath hitched in her throat. She looked at Patricia and then back at the screen. The video abruptly transitioned. The next clip showed Patricia walking into my kitchen, looking around to ensure she was alone and deliberately turning on the gas stove before hurrying upstairs. The following clip showed Gary digging through the kitchen trash to hide my mail. Then the video showed Patricia stealing my keys from the kitchen island. Megan turned entirely pale. The illusion shattered right in front of her. She realized the terrifying kitchen fire was a calculated setup. She realized her father was never losing his mind. She realized she had been manipulated into crying over a dementia diagnosis that was entirely manufactured by the people sitting across the table. Megan looked at me, and the profound heartbreak in her eyes slowly transformed into a rising tide of absolute fury. She pushed her chair away from Todd, physically putting distance between herself and the monsters she had welcomed into our home. I tapped the tablet screen one last time. The camera angle changed to the hidden lens in my home office. The video showed Todd prying my locked door open with a screwdriver and violently rifling through my desk. The audio of his phone call played loudly for everyone to hear. Todd was speaking to the offshore lender. He was explicitly detailing his massive illegal gambling debts. He was bragging about forging my signature on the equity loan to secure the cash. He cheerfully explained his plan to use the leftover stolen funds to buy his bankrupt parents a luxury condo in the city. Todd physically collapsed against the edge of the dining table. He was shaking uncontrollably and sweating profusely. He looked at Megan, pleading with his eyes, but she recoiled from him in total disgust. Gary and Patricia were entirely silent. Their smug entitlement had been completely obliterated. They were stripped bare and exposed as the destitute parasites they truly were. I unplugged the tablet, and the television went black. The sudden quiet was heavier than before. I walked back to my chair and looked at Warren. Warren stepped forward and placed his heavy leather briefcase on the table. He opened it with a sharp click and pulled out a thick manila folder. He slid it slowly across the polished wood until it stopped right in front of Todd. Warren spoke with a cold and devastating calm. He told Todd that the lending institution received his expedited loan application yesterday morning. He explained that the bank executives opened the overnight package expecting to find a fully executed and signed contract. Instead, they found completely blank signature lines. Warren watched the confusion wash over Todd before delivering the lethal blow. He explained that the ink used to sign those documents was a highly specialized and chemically volatile compound. Within 24 hours of touching the paper, the ink completely evaporated into thin air, leaving absolutely no trace behind. Todd had submitted a stack of forged documents signed with invisible ink. Todd stammered, trying to form a coherent sentence. He tried to claim that if the ink disappeared, then there was no forged contract and therefore no crime. Warren smiled a chilling corporate smile. He told Todd that while the ink vanished, the digital footprint did not. Warren explained that he had personally notified the bank of the fraudulent application 48 hours before the package even arrived in their mailroom. The bank representative standing next to the deputy stepped forward. He confirmed that the lending institution had already partnered with federal authorities. He stated that filling out a fraudulent loan application and sending it through the postal service across state lines with the explicit intent to secure illegal funds constitutes severe federal wire fraud. It did not matter that the ink disappeared. The invisible ink was simply the bait required to get Todd to commit a federal crime through the mail. The audio and video recordings of his phone call combined with the tracked delivery of the package provided the bank with undeniable proof of his malicious intent. Todd was completely and inescapably cornered. Warren leaned over the table and informed Todd that the authorities were actively freezing every single bank account associated with his name. He added that the offshore gambling syndicates were also going to be heavily scrutinized by federal investigators, meaning the dangerous people Todd owed money to would be looking for someone to blame. The masterstroke was flawless. Todd had tried to steal an estate that was legally protected by an irrevocable trust. He had tried to forge signatures using ink that did not exist, and he had documented his own federal crimes on high-definition cameras he was too arrogant to notice. The audit was officially complete, and the guilty party was facing absolute total ruin. Todd stood trembling by the dining table, his chest heaving as the crushing weight of federal wire fraud extinguished the very last spark of his arrogance. He looked frantically around the room, his eyes darting from Warren to the bank representative, before finally landing on the one person who had always served as his ultimate shield. He turned to Megan. He reached out a shaking, sweating hand, his voice cracking, as he begged her to tell the authorities it was all a massive misunderstanding. He pleaded with his wife to call a defense lawyer to tap into her protected savings account to fix this disaster and to stand by her husband. Megan did not reach back. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. The heavy exhaustion that had weighed her down for weeks was completely gone, replaced by a cold, devastating clarity. She looked at the man she had married, seeing right past the charming smile and the tailored suits. She saw the desperate, reckless gambling addict who had tried to sell her own father's sanity just to save himself. She did not yell, and she did not shed a single tear. She reached down to her left hand and gripped her diamond wedding ring. She pulled the band over her knuckle and placed it deliberately onto the polished mahogany table. The heavy metal made a sharp final click against the wood. She looked Todd directly in the eyes, told him she never wanted to see his face again, and walked straight down the hallway. The heavy front door opened and closed with a solid echoing thud. She was gone, and she was taking her protected trust funds and her pristine credit score with her. Todd let out a pathetic, suffocated gasp as he watched his entire financial lifeline walk out the door. He took a stumbling step forward, but the local sheriff deputy immediately stepped into his path, blocking his escape. The deputy unclipped the radio from his shoulder and informed Todd that he was officially being detained for questioning regarding an active federal investigation into wire and bank fraud. Todd tried to argue, his voice raising into a frantic, high-pitched whine. He pointed his shaking finger at me, screaming that I had set him up, that I had tricked him with invisible ink. The bank representative simply closed his manila folder, entirely unimpressed by the desperate outburst. The deputy firmly grasped Todd by the bicep, turned him around, and marched him toward the entryway. Todd dragged his feet, looking back at his parents, begging them to do something, to call someone to help him. But Gary and Patricia remained completely frozen in their dining chairs, paralyzed by the sudden, spectacular destruction of their parasitic empire. They watched in absolute silence as their son, the architect of their luxury retirement plan, was escorted out of the lake house and shoved into the back of a waiting police cruiser. I waited until the flashing red and blue lights of the cruiser pulled out of my driveway and disappeared down the darkening road. The house was painfully quiet again. Warren and the bank representative nodded to me, packed up their briefcases, and quietly let themselves out the front door, their job perfectly executed. I turned my attention to the opposite end of the long dining table. Gary and Patricia were sitting close together, their faces pale and drawn. The expensive champagne in their crystal flutes had gone entirely flat. There was no more talk of velvet sectionals or luxury river cruises in Vienna. They looked exactly like two terrified trespassers who had just been caught trying to rob a bank vault. I walked slowly to the head of the table. I did not slump my shoulders. I did not shuffle my feet. I stood tall, feeling the strength and authority return to my spine. I looked down at the two people who had stolen my keys, thrown away my mail, and left an open flame burning in my kitchen, just to drive me mad. "You wanted this arrangement to be permanent," I said, keeping my voice incredibly cold and perfectly steady. "You wanted to stay in my home until the day I died." Gary opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer a hollow apology, or to beg for a few days to figure out their housing situation, but I did not let him utter a single syllable. I pointed a steady finger toward the staircase. "You have exactly 30 minutes to pack your matching luggage. When the clock strikes 8, anything left inside these walls goes directly into the lake, and you will be legally and permanently trespassing." They did not argue. They scrambled out of their chairs and practically sprinted up the stairs to the master suite. Exactly 28 minutes later, I stood on the front porch and watched them drag their heavy designer suitcases across the rough wood of the floorboards. They did not have a luxury sport utility vehicle waiting for them anymore. Todd had driven it away in handcuffs, and the bank was undoubtedly preparing to repossess it. Gary and Patricia walked down the porch steps and began the long, humiliating march down the half-mile gravel driveway on foot. The heavy plastic wheels of their luggage crunched loudly against the jagged stones, echoing into the dark woods. They had absolutely nowhere to go, and I absolutely did not care. I walked back into the dining room. I picked up the bottle of 20-year-old single-barrel bourbon that Gary had so arrogantly opened. I poured a generous measure into a clean crystal glass. I carried the glass through the quiet, empty house out the back door and walked down to the dock. The evening air was cool and incredibly fresh. I sat down in the mahogany deck chair I had built with my own 2 hands. I took a slow sip of the amber liquid. It tasted like absolute unbroken peace. I watched the golden sun dip below the deep blue water of the lake, listening to the gentle lapping of the waves, finally reclaiming the silent sanctuary I had earned. The fundamental lesson from these scenarios is the overwhelming power of silence and meticulous preparation. When faced with profound betrayal from those closest to you, the instinct is often to erupt in anger or demand immediate justice. However, true leverage lies in restraint. By refusing to engage in emotional warfare, you deny the manipulators the reaction they need to play the victim or justify their cruelty. Instead, use that quiet time to audit the situation, gather irrefutable evidence, and construct a defense so impenetrable that when you finally act, the consequences are swift, decisive, and absolute. What would you do if you discovered a secret that changed everything about your family? Let us know in the comments below.